Next speaker, Bonnie Docherty, has been involved in humanitarian disarmament for 16 years. She was part of the Cluster Ammunition Convention negotiation team. She conducted research on the humanitarian impact of cluster ammunition and provided legal advice to the Cluster Ammunition Coalition, working for Human Rights Watch. For the last year, she has been a crucial member of the negotiation team of ICAN, providing legal advice for ICAN during the negotiations. She was pivotal in getting positive obligations into the treaty regarding victim assistance and environmental remediation. Docherty is currently working at the International Human Rights Clinic at Harvard Law School, where she's currently launching a new initiative on armed conflict and civilian protection. In the second lecture of today's seminar, the topic will be the legal content and impact of the Treaty on Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We know now that we didn't really need it because it was illegal anyway, right? Bonnie, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Vidar, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me, and to all of you for coming out today on a very busy weekend and week. So it's a real honor to be able to talk about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW as I'll call it for short, as part of the celebration that recognizes not only ICAN's tireless and effective advocacy, but also the importance of the treaty itself, the treaty that the coalition helped produce, as well as the humanitarian disarmament movement of which the treaty is part. Today I'll focus, as Vidar said, on the content and legal impact of the TPNW through a humanitarian lens. I'll focus on the key elements of the TPNW and how they fit the characteristics of a humanitarian disarmament treaty, the impact of the Treaty on Nuclear Weapons Law, and the impact of the Treaty on Humanitarian Disarmament Law. The significance of the humanitarian approach to nuclear weapons will be evident throughout the discussion. It served as a catalyst for the negotiation process. It shaped the purpose and provisions of the treaty and will affect its long-term impact. The humanitarian concerns about nuclear weapons, I think Lou mentioned this earlier, gave rise to and propelled the process that led to the TPNW. For at least 2 decades, nuclear disarmament had been mired in discussions about national security interests. Meetings of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, provided a forum for debate, but progress toward negotiating a nuclear disarmament treaty, as required under Article 6, which Gru talked about, was minimal. The humanitarian initiative, which emerged around 2010, changed the landscape by reframing the issue of nuclear weapons as a humanitarian one. During the meetings in Norway, Austria, and Mexico in 2013 and 14, proponents of a ban treaty highlighted the humanitarian impact, the humanitarian horrors of nuclear weapons, not only by documenting the harm of past use and testing, but also by describing the potential effects of the exponentially more powerful contemporary weapons. In so doing, they emphasized the importance and urgency of addressing them. At the same time, the humanitarian initiative treated nuclear weapons like other inhumane and indiscriminate weapons. By thus demystifying them, it opened up the possibility for real progress. The UN General Assembly responded by adopting a resolution in 2016 that called for negotiations of a treaty banning nuclear weapons. The treaty was adopted on July 7th of this year by 122 states, with only 1 abstention and 1 voting against. And it now has 53 signatories and 3 states parties, and more are expected soon. While the focus of my remarks is substance, not process, I think it's important to understand the humanitarian origins of the TPNW because they inform both its content and its legal impact. The TPNW includes 20 articles, but the key provisions can be divided into 4 groups. First, the Preamble. Second, the preventive measures, including prohibitions and requirements to eliminate nuclear weapons. Third, the remedial measures, often known as positive obligations. And finally, the implementation provisions. Together, they create a strong, legally binding instrument that evinces and advances an underlying humanitarian aim. So the Preamble, which is non-binding, but is important because it makes clear the object and purpose of the treaty. It makes it clear that the purpose is to reduce human suffering through the elimination of nuclear weapons. It foregrounds concerns about the impacts of nuclear weapons from testing, use, accidents, and other causes. The second paragraph, right from the top, declares that state parties are, quote, deeply concerned about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences that would result from any use of nuclear weapons. The preamble goes on to highlight a range of effects, including, quote, the grave implications for human survival, the environment, socioeconomic development, the global economy, food security, and the health of current and future generations. It also recognizes the unacceptable suffering of victims. The preamble links these harms to the very existence of nuclear weapons and concludes that the catastrophic consequences require completely eliminating nuclear weapons. It describes elimination as, quote, the only way to guarantee that nuclear weapons are never used again under any circumstances. It also considers the treaty, quote, an important contribution toward a world free of nuclear weapons. While the first half of the preamble deals largely with the effects of nuclear weapons and the motivations for banning them, the second half places TPNW in a human-centered legal framework. It begins its series of paragraphs on the law by reaffirming the need to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law and international human rights law. It specifies that it is based on the principles and rules of IHL. The preamble explicitly declares that, quote, any use of nuclear weapons would be contrary to the principles and rules of international humanitarian law, and thus contrasts with the ICJ, the International Court of Justice advisory opinion, which left ambiguity about the legality of use. The preamble also states that nuclear weapons would be abhorrent to the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience. And these words derive from the Martens Clause, a provision of IHL that suggests that the means and methods of war must meet certain moral standards as well as legal ones. The content of the TPNW's preamble is not exclusively humanitarian in nature. It refers in several places to international peace and security and notes the importance of national and collective security interests. Towards the end, the preamble recognizes the importance of past nuclear weapons-specific treaties that were driven largely by national security interests. It notably mentions the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and the Nuclear Weapon Free Zone agreements, all of which you heard about in the first talk today. Overall, however, the preamble gives precedence to humanitarian concerns through the quantity, placement, and strength of relevant paragraphs. The treaty addresses two types of preventive measures, the second cluster I'll talk about, measures that seek to avert the humanitarian consequences before they happen. And these are the prohibitions and the steps you must take to eliminating nuclear weapons, particularly stockpile destruction. The prohibitions enumerated in Article 1 are both absolute and wide-ranging. They apply under any circumstances, which would cover times of international and non-international armed conflict during which nuclear weapons might be used. They also cover times of peace when development, testing, and other activities may take place. The prohibitions are comprehensive because they ban activities every step of the nuclear weapons lifespan, including those involved with the creation of nuclear weapons, the development, testing, and production and manufacture stage, activities that are involved with obtaining nuclear weapons, notably acquisition and transfer, those involving possession and stockpiling, and finally, use and threat of use. Article 1 also prohibits assisting, encouraging, or inducing anyone to engage in any of these prohibited activities. This broad provision leaves room for interpretation, but it should be understood to cover a range of acts such as financing. Significant number of states said during the negotiations that they would understand the prohibition to encompass financing because it entails with assistance with the production of nuclear weapons. Interpretations of parallel provisions in past humanitarian disarmament treaties support that understanding. Finally, Article 1 includes multiple prohibitions associated with the state party's relationship with a state not party, the country outside the treaty, which possesses nuclear weapons. The state party is explicitly obliged not to allow a nuclear weapons state to station or deploy nuclear weapons in its territory. The prohibitions on threat of use and on assistance, encouragement, and inducement prohibit states parties from depending on another state's nuclear weapons for their national security. In other words, and I'll talk about this a little more later, a state may not remain under a nuclear umbrella if it joins the treaty. The comprehensiveness of the TPNW's prohibitions is essential because it brings an end to the existence, not merely the use, of nuclear weapons. In so doing, it advances the treaty's humanitarian goals by striving to prevent future harm. The third cluster I'll talk about is the preventive measure, another part of the second part, is the preventive measures, which appear in Articles 2 through 4, which are directed at the total elimination of nuclear weapons. The list required actions rather than prohibited ones, but they serve the same purpose of preventing future harm. To promote transparency, Article 2 obliges all states to declare whether they possess nuclear weapons or have nuclear weapons on their territory. Article 3 mandates that they comply with International Atomic Energy Agency safeguards. And most important, Article 4 establishes a process by which nuclear weapons states must destroy their stockpiles as soon as possible. Similarly, states hosting other states' nuclear weapons are obliged to ensure their removal as soon as possible. The treaty does not detail verification measures, but calls for those to be developed at a later date. These articles are designed to attract nuclear weapon states by allowing them to join the TPNW and then destroy their nuclear weapons. The articles advance the TPNW's aims because they promote both universalization of the new treaty and elimination of nuclear weapons. The TPNW's preventive measures are a prerequisite to the elimination of nuclear weapons, but the treaty does not stop there. To further its humanitarian goals, it draws on international human rights law and is to establish positive obligations to assist victims and remediate the environment. Article 6 obliges states parties to provide individuals affected by the use or testing of nuclear weapons with a range of assistance. This assistance includes physical and psychological care, rehabilitation, and means to ensure their socioeconomic inclusion. Assistance is designed not as a form of charity, but as a means to ensure victims can exercise their human rights. Consistent with the treaty's interest in guaranteeing human rights, the TPNW states that assistance must be provided without discrimination. States parties must also take steps to remediate the environment, which has been contaminated, again, by use or testing. The treaty doesn't presume that states parties could return the environment to a pre-detonation state. That would be impossible. But states must take necessary and appropriate measures towards that goal. The provisions on victim assistance and environmental remediation are both designed to address the ongoing harm of past use and testing, as well as any harm from future use and testing, which hopefully the treaty will prevent. To promote the implementation of the positive obligations, the treaty establishes a framework of shared responsibility. Primary responsibility for victim assistance and environmental remediation rests with the affected states parties. While it may seem counterintuitive that the state harmed by use or testing of nuclear weapons should have such obligations, the approach is actually practical and consistent with international law. Affected states are well situated to understand their own needs and to the needs of their people. They're also in the best position to provide assistance because they are closest to the problem. In addition, this approach follows the precedent set by past disarmament treaties, notably the Convention on Cluster Munitions and the Mine Ban Treaty, and is consistent with human rights law, under which a state must take care of assuring its people can enjoy their rights. Finally, the approach protects the sovereignty of the affected state by allowing it to manage matters within its boundaries. That said, the affected state does not have to bear the burden by itself. The TPNW makes clear that all states have a role to play in victim assistance and environmental remediation. Article 7 on international cooperation and assistance requires other states parties in a position to do so to help the affected state meet its positive obligations. Because assistance can come in a variety of forms, such as technical, material, and financial, all states should be in a position to help in some way. A third level of responsibility rests with the states parties that used or tested the nuclear weapons. They must provide adequate assistance to help affected states parties assist the victims and remediate the environment. The inclusion of a user state responsibility provision was very important to many of the negotiating states and is a matter of principle as well as practical impact. Nothing in the framework of positive obligations, however, precludes an affected state from seeking other forms of legal redress from user states. The last group of provisions that I will discuss relate to the implementation of the treaty. I won't examine them all in detail, but there are a few worth highlighting. Article 5 requires states parties to take national measures to implement the treaty. It specifies that they must impose penal sanctions for the commission of prohibited acts. But they also must adapt, quote, necessary measures to implement their obligations, indicating that it will require to implement the positive as well as the negative obligations domestically. The treaty also requires state actions at the international level. States parties are obliged to promote the universalization of the treaty by encouraging other states to join. They must hold regular meetings of states parties and review conferences to assess the progress in implementation, and such meetings will help hold states parties to account. Finally, the treaty seeks to maintain its strength by allowing no reservations and by placing restrictions on withdrawal. Many states and civil society organizations would have preferred that the treaty not permit withdrawal, but at least Article 17 does include some limitations. It forbids withdrawal during times of armed conflict, and furthermore, it allows a state party to withdraw when extraordinary events have jeopardized its supreme interests, and the state party must explain those extraordinary events when giving notice of its intention to withdraw. This cluster of provisions promotes the implementation and the power of the treaty. With the elements I just outlined, the TPNW possesses all the key characteristics of a humanitarian disarmament treaty. Humanitarian disarmament seeks to end the civilian suffering from indiscriminate and inhumane weapons. The treaty, that movement, which originated in the 1990s with the Mine Ban Treaty, which banned anti-personnel mines, and the movement was reinforced and strengthened by the Convention on Cluster Munitions, which prohibited cluster munitions because they cause unacceptable harm. The latter treaty, you may well know, emerged from a Norwegian initiative that led to the Oslo process, and it was signed 9 years ago, almost to the week where yesterday's Nobel Peace Prize ceremony took place. The TPNW fits the definition of a humanitarian disarmament treaty, both in its purpose and its provisions. As I discussed, the TPNW seeks to end the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, a goal that is reminiscent of the Convention on Cluster Munitions, quote, determination to put an end for all time to the suffering and casualties caused by cluster munitions. Regarding preventive measures, the TPNW, like the Mine Ban Treaty and the Convention on Cluster Munitions, contains absolute prohibitions on the use, production, stockpiling, and transfer of nuclear weapons, as well as assistance with these activities. It also seeks to prevent future use and testing through its obligation to destroy stockpiles. The TPNW obliges states to take remedial measures to minimize the harm by nuclear weapons. It establishes basic requirements for victim assistance that are almost identical to those in the Convention on Cluster Munitions, which is the gold standard in this area. The TPNW also requires states parties to clear territories affected by remnants of these weapons. Finally, the TPNW adopts a cooperative approach to implementation. It requires all states parties to provide international cooperation and assistance to help other states meet their obligations. And rather than establish a detailed verification regime or adversarial enforcement mechanism, it encouraged states parties to settle disputes through negotiation and other peaceful means. The humanitarian nature of the TPNW is inextricably linked to its legal impact as well as content. The humanitarian disarmament approach allowed the TPNW to revolutionize the law governing nuclear weapons, facilitated significant progress towards the weapons elimination, and an increase in civilian protection. In return, the TPNW reinforced and advanced humanitarian disarmament law, demonstrating its continued effectiveness and ability to evolve. Excuse me for 1 second. I will highlight 3 major impacts of the TPNW on nuclear weapons law. Each represents a sea change made possible by the application to nuclear weapons of the humanitarian approach to disarmament, which offered fresh perspectives and underlined the urgency of stronger law. First, the treaty makes nuclear weapons illegal as well as immoral. For many people, nuclear weapons have long been considered immoral, and the TPNW echoes that view with preambular clauses. For example, it refers to, quote, ethical imperatives for nuclear disarmament. Until now, however, international law dealing with nuclear weapons consisted only of partial prohibitions and restrictions, and Gru explained those very well this morning. But just to reiterate, the NPT prohibited proliferation, but did not require an immediate end to possession. The various test ban treaties only restricted testing, and with the exception of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which is not entered into force, they applied only to certain areas, notably outer space, underwater, and the atmosphere. The nuclear weapon-free zones provided the strongest restrictions as they outlawed nuclear weapons, but their effects were limited to certain regions. The TPNW takes a radically different approach. Article 1 creates a legally binding prohibition on all major activities associated with nuclear weapons. As I mentioned, it applies under any circumstances, and all states parties, regardless of the region they come from. And so far, we already have signatories from Africa, Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and the Pacific, which is a great start to universalization. By making nuclear weapons clearly and comprehensive unlawful, the TPNW not only limits the actions of states parties, but also increases the stigma of the weapons and puts political pressure on even states not party to abide by its rules. Widespread compliance with the Mine Ban Treaty's rules by states not party exemplifies the power of stigma. The second impact of the treaty on nuclear weapons law is that it challenges the status quo. Earlier law took a gradual step-by-step approach toward general and complete disarmament, but in the process it reinforced the existing situation. The NPT, for example, sought to limit the spread of nuclear weapons, but in the process it preserved the hierarchy of haves and have-nots. While non-nuclear weapon states agreed not to obtain the weapons, nuclear weapon states were allowed to keep their arsenals. They agreed under Article 6 to work in good faith towards nuclear disarmament, but they have made little progress on that front, at least through the NPT framework. The TPNW directly rejects such an incremental approach. It requires all states parties to cease production, transfer, use, and testing of nuclear weapons right away. And it obliges states parties to remove nuclear weapons from operational status immediately and destroy them, quote, as soon as possible. A specific deadline will be set at the first meeting of states parties. The TPNW also challenges the status quo by making it illegal for states parties to rely on the protection of a nuclear umbrella. Its provisions on both threat of use and on assistance, encouragement, and inducement prohibit a state party from depending on nuclear weapons, even those possessed by a state not party, for its national security. Drafters included the threat of use prohibition specifically to achieve this end. Depending on nuclear weapons for security constitutes a threat because a state party is willing and able to have nuclear weapons used on its behalf, and it clearly communicates that position through collective security agreements, statements, or other means. In addition, the treaty prohibits states parties from receiving assistance with a prohibited act. By accepting a nuclear weapon state's protection with nuclear weapons, a state party is receiving assistance with the threat of use. Finally, being part of a nuclear security arrangement runs counter to the prohibition on encouraging prohibited acts. It encourages another state to possess, threaten to use, and use nuclear weapons. These provisions make it more challenging for nuclear weapon states and nuclear umbrella states to join the TPNW, but the obstacles they face are primarily political rather than legal. By upending the status quo, the treaty was able to take a leap rather than a small step towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. The third impact of the TPNW on nuclear weapons law involves its positive obligations. Previous international law did not seek to reduce the harm already caused by nuclear weapons, whether through use or testing. Some states established compensation regimes, but they were national or bilateral, they weren't human rights based, and sometimes required establishment of legal liability. Even in early stages of the process of the TPNW, many states and even some civil society members did not envision the inclusion of positive obligations. But in the end, the TPNW created an international framework of responsibility that focuses on meeting the needs of victims and the environment. Positive obligations are also important because they constitute an area where the treaty can have immediate humanitarian impact. Their implementation does not depend on nuclear weapons states who are unlikely to join the treaty in the near future. All states parties bear some responsibility for the TPNW's remedial measures, so implementation should begin as soon as the treaty enters into force. The legal impact of the TPNW will extend beyond nuclear weapons law to disarmament law, and particularly to humanitarian disarmament law. As the most recent humanitarian disarmament treaty, it confirms that the body of law is a powerful, effective, and feasible way to address the effects of inhumane and indiscriminate weapons. The TPNW has the same general goal as its predecessors, that is, to end civilian suffering caused by problematic weapons. It borrows the key elements and in many cases exact language from its predecessors. For example, the wording of its victim assistance provision and several of the paragraphs in its international cooperation and assistance article are almost identical to those in the Convention on Cluster Munitions. In so doing, the TPNW demonstrates that humanitarian disarmament is widely accepted and adaptable. The TPNW also advances humanitarian disarmament by applying it to a new class of weapons, weapons of mass destruction, and particularly, of course, nuclear weapons. Although biological and chemical weapons have long been banned, the treaties that govern them focus more on addressing national security concerns. Its approach is evident, for example, in the Chemical Weapons Convention's preambular language and its provisions, which emphasize prohibitions and strict verification regime. The TPNW takes a different approach, a humanitarian one, to weapons of mass destruction. So it includes remedial as well as preventive measures and adopts a more cooperative approach to compliance. More specifically, the TPNW applies humanitarian disarmament to nuclear weapons, which have long been viewed as the most challenging weapon to legally control. Over the years, both states and disarmament advocates have viewed nuclear weapons as an exceptional weapon to which different rules would have to apply. Humanitarian disarmament rose to the challenge, however. Through the TPNW, it successfully closed a gap in disarmament law. Previously, as we've heard today, nuclear weapons were the only WMD not banned, even though they had the potential to cause the greatest harm. In turn, the TPNW showed that humanitarian disarmament can work for all types of weapons, both in driving the process and in shaping the contents of the treaty. In the course of adapting humanitarian disarmament provisions to a new type of weapon, the TPNW advances that body of law in several ways. In its preamble, it incorporates several progressive elements not included in past humanitarian disarmament treaties. For example, it explicitly recognizes the disproportionate impacts on certain groups, particularly indigenous peoples and women and girls. It also highlights the importance of disarmament education, which can be a tool for raising awareness of the human consequences of weapons and for disseminating the legal norms that deal with them. The TPNW also creates rules related to activities, notably testing and threat of use, that are not addressed in past humanitarian disarmament treaties. Both testing and use have contributed significantly. Testing and threat of use, have contributed significantly to the problems of nuclear weapons. A large portion of the human and environmental harm attributable to nuclear weapons has come from testing, and the TPNW highlights the consequences of testing in its preamble. It seeks to mitigate the harm by preventing future testing and applying its positive obligations to the effects of testing as well as use. Nuclear deterrence policies have long been used as an excuse for retaining nuclear weapons, but the TPNW bans threat of use, presumably because the threat of use to prohibit dependence on such policies by nuclear weapons or nuclear umbrella states. But the past humanitarian disarmament treaties do not touch on testing or threat of use, presumably because their activities are less relevant to landmines and cluster munitions. But their inclusion in the TPNW shows humanitarian disarmament's ability to adapt to the problems of different weapons. And it may also set an important standard for dealing with future weapons, such as fully autonomous weapons, if technology outpaces efforts to preemptively ban them. Finally, the TPNW expands the scope of the positive obligations to address the harm caused by toxic remnants of war rather than just explosive remnants of war. Past humanitarian disarmament treaties require clearance of landmines and unexploded submunitions because the explosive effects of these remnants of war can endanger civilians long after a conflict. The character of nuclear weapons, however, necessitated a different approach. While the initial blast of a nuclear weapon creates a huge explosion with devastating effects, many of its long-lasting impacts are the result of toxins and radioactivity. The TPNW addresses these harms as part of its positive obligations, and it requires states parties to assist victims of TRW, toxic remnants of war, as well as to remediate contaminated areas. So in conclusion, the TPNW, I believe, is a legal breakthrough. It establishes comprehensive rules to reduce the harm from nuclear weapons and promote their ultimate elimination. It will have a significant effect on the future of nuclear weapons law and on humanitarian disarmament law. Nonetheless, much work remains to be done. The TPNW needs to be universalized expeditiously, interpreted strongly, and implemented fully so that it can achieve its true humanitarian potential. So thank you, and hopefully we're a little back on schedule.